Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on 5 Polish tanks that were badly needed in September 1939 during the German invasion of Poland, and later on September the 17th, 1939, during the Soviet invasion of Poland. When the Germans and later the Soviets invaded Poland, they largely used light tanks. These were light tanks like the German Panzer Is and Panzer IIs, and later on light Soviet tanks like the BT-5 and BT-7, and even the T-26 light tanks. These tanks spearheaded the way for the German and later Soviet forces to steamroll the Polish forces and reach the capital of Warsaw, and also the secondary capitals of Kharkov, Lublin, and a few other areas. Ultimately, the Poles were forced to hold the Romanian bridgehead and use this as a way to evacuate some of their forces through Romania in order to reach France. Many have asked the question, is there any way Poland could have beaten back both the Germans and the Soviet Union? Well, there is one way they could have, and this way would involve them defeating the German and later Soviet panzer divisions. Most of the German panzer divisions were made up of light tanks like the Panzer I, the Panzer II, and even some of the Czech-made Panzer 35T and Panzer 38T light tanks, while Soviet tanks were mostly made of BT-5, BT-7, and T-26 light tank divisions, armored divisions. So these tanks were mostly lightly armored. Most of these tanks only had an armor thickness of about 10 to 20 millimeters for the German tanks, while the Soviet tanks had an armor thickness of 6 to 12 millimeters on almost all of the tanks they used during the invasion of Poland. The Germans also used some early medium tanks like the Panzer III and IV, these early model medium tanks having an armor thickness of only 30 to 50 millimeters. So the Poles needed a tank or an anti-tank weapon that could penetrate an armor thickness of at least 6 to 30 millimeters. And Poland did develop some tanks that could do this. These were light tank destroyers and tank-destroying tankettes. Let's go over some of the Polish tanks that were badly needed in September 1939. And the first tank on the list is a series of limited production light tank destroyer tankettes, known as either the TKS, FKA, and the TK3. These were experimental light tank destroyer tankettes that were developed between 1935 and 1939. These are two separate tank projects, but they are basically the same. These were TKS tankettes that were converted into tank destroyers. They were either armed with one 20mm Solothurn S18-100 anti-tank rifle imported from Switzerland, and later on in 1938 and 1939, the remainder were fitted with one 20mm Polish-made NKM WZ-38 FKA dual-purpose anti-aircraft and anti-tank autocannon. The armor penetration of these weapons was at least 13 to 25 millimeters at ranges of 500 to 1,000 yards. The armor thickness was only 4 to 10 millimeters because this was literally just a TKS with a larger gun. The speed was 45.8 kilometers per hour or 28.5 miles per hour. And they had a crew of 2. In total, only 24 of the TK3 and only 2 prototypes of the TKS armed with 20mm Solothurn were ever constructed by the eve of September on September 1st, 1939. These light tank destroyers were badly needed during the war. These light tank destroyers did perform pretty well during the campaign. On several instances, these TKS armed with 20mm anti-tank weapons managed to take out at least 20 to 30 German light and medium tanks. So these vehicles were badly needed. Poland had over 660 TKS variants, and these could have been converted into either a TKS with 20mm Solothurn rifle or the TKS with the 20mm Wiz-38 FKA anti-aircraft/anti-tank dual-purpose autocannon. Either way, the Poles needed something like this if they wanted to counter the large numbers of German light tanks like the Panzer Is and IIs, which all had armor thickness of less than 30 millimeters, meaning these TKS tank destroyers could defeat the majority of the Panzer Is entering Poland. This would have been useful for the Polish ground troops, as the TKS's main role was as an infantry support tankette. So the Polish infantry could have had an anti-tank tankette that could be used both as an anti-infantry weapon, or an infantry support vehicle, and also as an anti-tank weapon for taking out the lightly armored Panzer Is and IIs. Keep in mind, most of Germany's tanks used in the assault on Poland were Panzer Is and IIs, which made up over 60% of the German tank formations that were invading Poland. So a tankette like this was badly needed and could defeat most of the Panzer Is and IIs. The only real problems came from the Panzer 35T, the Panzer 38Ts, and the German-made Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. These tankettes could have been useful against the Soviet tanks, as the standard Soviet tank was the BT-5, BT-7, and the T-26 light tanks. All of these tanks had an armor thickness of only 6 to 12 millimeters, so the TKS armed with either a 20 millimeter rifle, 20 millimeter autocannon would have been an overkill to most of the Soviet light tanks. So the Polish infantry could have had an advantage if they had an entire fleet of TKS tankettes armed with either a 20 millimeter rifle or 20 millimeter autocannon. So these were badly needed, but only 24 vehicles plus 2 prototypes were constructed between 1935 and 1939. Another vehicle that was badly needed was an amphibious tank. Poland had a large number of rivers, and these rivers were used as defensive positions by the Polish forces during the war. They acted as a barrier for most of the German and Soviet tanks, as their tanks could not cross rivers that were too deep. But Poland actually did develop an experimental light amphibious tank, and that is the next tank on our list, the Polish Pzl 130, also known as the Pzl Inc 130. This was an experimental light amphibious tank developed between 1935 and 1937. It was one of the tanks that competed with the 70P series of light tanks before that tank entered full production. The main armament of this vehicle was one 20mm NKM with a 38 FKA dual-purpose anti-tank and anti-aircraft autocannon, just like the TKS. The armor penetration again was 13 to 25 millimeters at 500 to 1,000 yards. The vehicle had an armor thickness of 8 to 17 millimeters, and it had a speed of 61 kilometers per hour or 37.3 miles per hour, which made it faster than all of the German tanks and most of the Soviet tanks, with the exception of the BT-5 and 7, which had a speed of 78 miles per hour. Only one prototype of the Pzl Inc 130 was constructed in 1935 and was later tested in 1936. And the testing of this vehicle took way too long, and the reason being is Poland had lost interest in a light amphibious tank and had begun to focus on the 70P project. The reason they did this is because the 70P was already completed. It was a copy of the Vickers light tank, which were imported from Britain. Whereas this new light amphibious tank was a new design and it needed a bit more work. And they felt that it needed a bit more work. In reality, the project was pretty much finished by 1936, so they kind of wasted an entire year testing the vehicle. By 1937, the vehicle was largely rejected, although the Army continued to experiment with the vehicle up until 1938. By 1938, Poland had lost all interest in this light amphibious tank, and the project was canceled just before World War II. Now, if Poland had taken it seriously, they could have had a standard-issued light amphibious tank. This vehicle could have been used as a hit-and-run weapon, as it was able to cross the rivers of Poland, and could have been used in sneak attacks on German and Soviet panzer divisions. The 20mm autocannon could take out most of the German Panzer I and II light tanks, and virtually all of the Soviet light tanks, which all had an armor thickness of less than 20 millimeters. But ultimately, Poland did not take this project seriously, and the project was canceled by the end of 1938. Pretty much wasted potential. The Pzl Inc 130 is one of the few tanks that Poland could have used in 1939, and that would have been useful. The next tank on the list is an experimental Polish self-propelled gun. Another vehicle that the Polish army needed was a self-propelled artillery piece. The Germans had already been experimenting with the Sturmgeschütz, series of experimental assault guns, which would become standard issued later on in the war. The Soviet Union also had their own variants of self-propelled guns. These were variants of the T-26 light tank that were fitted with a 76.2mm gun, and they were used as a self-propelled gun. They also had variants of the BT-5 and BT-7 that were also self-propelled guns too. Poland didn't have this, at least not in large numbers, but they did develop one experimental self-propelled gun system between 1932 and 1933. That is the TKD. The TKD was an experimental self-propelled gun tankette from 1932 to 1933. It was armed with a rare experimental Polish dual-purpose anti-tank and field artillery gun, known as the 47mm Armata WZ-25. This was a newly made Polish gun developed at the end of the 1920s and was meant to replace the old 37mm SA-18 guns being used by Poland on their other tanks and armored cars. The armor thickness was the same as the standard TKS at 4 to 10mm, and it had the same speed and crew capacity. Only 3 to 4 of these vehicles were constructed for the Polish army, and they were tested up until 1934. Afterwards, they were pressed into service as training vehicles, but they were also used during the fighting in Poland in September 1939. But again, only 3 to 4 vehicles were completed, so they really didn't have much effect on the war. If the Poles had mass-produced this tankette as a standard-issued infantry support tankette, they would have had a better chance against both the Germans and the Soviets. The 47mm gun of this vehicle could penetrate between 20 and 35mm of armor. That wasn't a lot when compared to other 47mm guns that were developed at the same time, but this gun had a much shorter barrel than the standard 47mm gun. This vehicle could also use the old 37mm SA-18, just in case Poland didn't have enough of the 47mm Armata guns. This vehicle here could have been the standard issued vehicle for the Polish army. But ultimately, Poland didn't take it seriously, and the project was cancelled at the end of 1933 and 1934. The next tank on the list is another badly needed tank destroyer, and this one was developed in 1936. And this vehicle here could have wiped out most of the German medium tanks, including the Panzer IIIs and IVs, and even some of the heavier light tanks like the Panzer 35 and Panzer 38Ts. And that vehicle was the TKS-D. The TKS-D was a radical redesign of the TKS tankette into an elongated light self-propelled tank destroyer that was developed in 1936. It was armed with a Polish copy of the 37mm Bofors anti-tank gun, the same gun used by the Swedish armed forces. It could also use the same 47mm gun as the TKD, the vehicle I mentioned earlier. The armor thickness was a bit thinner at just 4 to 6mm, but it still had a speed of 45.8 kilometers per hour. The vehicle had an increased crew capacity of 3 to 4, but only 2 prototypes were built in 1936, and they were tested throughout the year in 1937. Ultimately, Poland would reject this vehicle, again, for the 70P series of light tanks. One of the reasons the Polish army felt that they didn't have enough factories to manufacture the tank. And at the same time, they were still manufacturing the standard models of the TKS tankette. So this vehicle was largely rejected. It could have been the second most powerful Polish tank destroyer of World War II. The 37mm Bofors had an armor penetration of between 25 and 45mm at 500 to 1,000 yards, so it could defeat the armor of even the early Panzer IIIs and IVs and would be an overkill to most of the Soviet light tanks being used in 1939. And it would have been an overkill to most, if not all, of the Soviet tanks used in the Polish campaign. But unfortunately, the Poles didn't take it seriously, and the project was cancelled by 1937. And finally, number one. The tank that Poland needed the most during the German and later Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939 And this vehicle here could have been the end-all be-all for the Polish army. This was the best tank that the Poles had developed in the interwar years, with the exception of the 70P itself. This vehicle here was the all-in-one. It was a tank and a tank destroyer and an assault gun, all rolled in one. That vehicle is the Pzl Inc. 160 and 161, and this was an experimental light tank destroyer. This vehicle here was armed with either one 47mm Armata Model 25 dual-purpose anti-tank and infantry support gun. It could also take the same 37mm Bofors Model 1934 anti-tank gun, and it can also use the even older SA-18 field gun, light field gun. The armor thickness was a lot thicker at 5 to 15 millimeters, even thicker than the old TKS tankette, and it had a speed of 50 kilometers per hour, or 31 miles per hour, and it had a crew of 3. This is what Poland really needed during the German and later Soviet invasion of Poland. It was a vehicle that could be used as both a tank destroyer and a self-propelled gun. It is a vehicle that could take out most, if not all, of the German tanks, and it could also wipe out all of the Soviet tanks, as all of the Soviet tanks had less than 20 millimeters of armor on their light tanks. The vehicle had an increased crew capacity of 3, so it wasn't as cramped as the TKS tankettes, and the vehicle was much faster, having a speed of 31 miles per hour. Making it faster than all of the German tanks, and making it just as fast as the Soviet tanks, with the exception of the BT-5 and 7, which were the fastest tanks. A single round from the 47mm or 37mm gun could take out the average German tank, and it can also be used as a field artillery piece, so it could be used as an infantry support gun. This vehicle, just like the last vehicle, is the Polish equivalent to an early Sturmgeschütz tank, except with a smaller gun, as the German Sturmgeschütz usually had a 75mm gun. This vehicle here is what Poland really needed. It was developed in 1937, but the project was cancelled in 1939. Poland simply took too long to develop the tank. It was a very good concept, but Poland had put most of their resources into the 70P and its offshoots, the 9TP, and later on the 14TP. These were other Polish light tanks that were underdeveloped at the same time as the 70P was entering mass production. So Poland simply didn't have enough time to manufacture this tank, and they didn't have the facilities to manufacture it to begin with. So only a single prototype was built, and that prototype is said to have been used during the campaign of 1939. These were the tanks that Poland truly needed in September 1939. If they had these tanks, they would have had a better chance at rolling back the Germans and the Soviet forces, as tanks were the main ground weapon that Poland really didn't have much of a defense against. They did have some anti-tank weapons and even some anti-tank rifles, but there weren't enough of them to hold back the German and later Soviet advance on Poland. So what do you all think of these vehicles? Please tell me in the comments section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.